Hello lovely people! This week I am here to do my autumn reading wrap up.
Dooby 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 doo. Dooby 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 Sophie vlogs.
At the start of autumn I set myself 8 books to read. I have read 6 of them, I'm currently reading the 7th and have not read the 8th, which I think is pretty well going. So, I'm just going to dive into it and talk to you about them because I have lots and lots of thoughts. So, first up we have Castle Door by Daphne du Maurier. This was originally started by Arthur Quiller Couch, and then he died, sadly, and then a while later his daughter asked Daphne du Maurier to finish it. It's like a contemporary retelling of the Tristan and Isolde myth, but, okay, well first of all, it's interesting because I couldn't tell you at what point during this Daphne du Maurier took over, but I feel like during the latter half is when I enjoyed this book the most, which I assume is Daphne du Maurier's writing. It's kind of hard to tell. It does sort of seamlessly transition, but there are like, I can tell that I prefer the way Daphne du Maurier writes. There's one particular quotation of this, which I really hated. The most ancient cirque of Castle Door, deserted, bramble-grown, was the very nipple of a huge breast in pain, aching for discharge. And that is a disgusting metaphor that I hate. On to the actual content of this book. I think what I enjoyed about this was this interesting concept whereby the Tristan and Isolde myth exists within this, and it's almost like the main characters are sort of like trapped, and it's like this repeating cycle whereby people are constantly repeating the story. Like it's like the souls of them live on, and they keep finding hosts and doing this story, but also the literary tradition of Tristan and Isolde exists. So there's a lot of like discussion of contrasting traditions, and so like within the Celtic diaspora, so like this is set in Cornwall, but then also like the Tristan figure is Breton. So that was really interesting. As I said, I got more into this as it went on. On the whole, I enjoyed it, but it's not my favourite du Maurier. I prefer when she's just being her, doing her thing, like Rebecca, Jamaica It, and that sort of thing. Next up is some non-fiction, which is Meadowland by John Lewis Stempel. I read this at the perfect time because I read this when autumn was that sort of golden, sunshiny autumn, like the leaves are changing, that sort of thing. This is essentially, it's just this guy who lives on the border between England and Wales. He has a farm, and this whole book is just from January to December, tracing the development of nature in those farms, like the changes that are happening, the different animals, and there's lots of like literary quotations and stuff like this. Like he's obviously very learned in many ways, and also like has this real connection to nature. And I'm really lucky that I work on a converted farm. Like it is a farm that still functions, and then there's just a bit of it which is offices, which is where I work. So I got to read this, and I was like, there were little moorhens splashing about, there were dragonflies whizzing past, it was funny, the leaves were changing, it was just like a really gorgeous moment. So I'm finding I'm really enjoying nature writing. If you are someone who likes nature writing and haven't read this yet, I would really recommend this. Which then leads into, I immediately followed it up with The Wild Folk by Sylvia v. Lindsteadt, which was perfect because nature has a real role in this one as well. So this is a children's like magical sort of fantasy book. It's set in Farallone, and essentially there's the city and there's the country and then there's the wild folk. So Tin lives in the city, and the Brotherhood, they're essentially trying to get this star gold, which is like kind of just a metaphor for like oil, essentially, let's be honest. And it's really exploitative and horrible and rubbish. And then Comfrey lives in the country, and the country folk have learning to work in tandem with nature, because there was this big horrendous cataclysmic event, and then ever since, like, the city's walled itself off from the country have tried to like regrow. And then there's the wild folk. The wild folk are like this, like you get bobcat girls and these witchy, like bear witches and stuff like this. Like it's like nature and humanity combined, but they're like this law unto themselves. And so there's this whole gorgeous mythology at play here, essentially. And essentially, Tin and Comfrey. This is book 1 of a 2-part series. The second book hasn't been released yet. And in this first one, it's like we've got this real overarching story of this. They've got to save the world and save their reality essentially from this greed of the Brotherhood that it threatens to destroy like nature and all that is good and that sort of thing. So there's this real love of nature that runs through this as well, and it was so gorgeous. It was really magical and lovely, and I felt really heartwarmed, and I really do want to read the second part because it was just really sweet. Then we have Human Croquet by Kate Atkinson. This is my fourth Kate Atkinson. I probably liked this one the least, but I did also really like the other ones I read, so this was like a perfectly enjoyable read, but it's not my favourite in comparison to her others. This was, so Isabel is our main character, and essentially Isabel, I find summing up the plot of this so hard to do because it's like simple but also convoluted. Isabel has a dysfunctional family. Her mother disappeared. Her father left for ages and claimed amnesia and then came back and blah, 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 blah. Essentially, Isabel's just turned 16 and she keeps falling out of time. She keeps falling into pockets of other times. Everyone has stuff going on. There's this deep brooding dark secrets at the heart of everything. And as this goes on, you are finding out what's happening. I liked this. There was a point around the halfway to three-quarter mark where I got a bit fed up. There's like a repetitious moment, which if you've read it, I hope you'll know what I'm talking about, that I just got a bit bored with. And yeah, so Kate Atkinson always has like an interesting narrative style, but this was potentially I think, okay, just to interrupt that thought, I think my thing is I can see elements of behind the scenes at the museum in this. I can see elements of life after life with this, especially with the way that time is treated and secrets are treated and that sort of thing. However, I felt like both of those two books had a clearer idea of what they were doing, and so they executed it better. So yeah, my overwhelming feeling with this was just I felt like it was more unfocused than the other books I've read. That's about all I feel like I have to say without diving into proper spoilers. Following on from that, we've got Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, which was an absolute treat. I first tried to read Jane Austen when I was a teenager, and I just didn't get it. I thought it was so boring, and I railed against her, and I was like, oh, Jane Austen, she's so boring. And now I'm a complete convert, and I love her so much, and this is my third one I've read. This is the first one I've read where I didn't know the plot beforehand. The other ones were Emma and Pride and Prejudice, which I knew the plot of. I really enjoyed this. It's like riffing off of Gothic conventions, and Catherine Morland as our protagonist, she goes to Bath, she stays with some people, meets a bunch of people, including like Mr. Tilney, a romantic love interest, and then she goes to stay with him and his family at Northanger Abbey, and she's like so into Gothic novels that she's like, I'm staying in a Gothic Abbey. Something terribly Gothic must happen while I'm here. And she keeps like reading into all these situations, like drama and intrigue and all this stuff. And it's like, it's just normal, babe. Stop scuppering your romantic chances by thinking that like something shady is afoot when it's not happening, but like in the best way. So this was a really real treat, and also I read this in like a day, like a weekend day, like I spent most of the day reading it, but just because I got so hooked. And Jane Austen, this was so accessible to me. Sometimes Jane Austen I find, or like in my head I'm like, oh, Jane Austen, like not an easy read or whatever, but actually this was such an easy read, so I have to like mentally take that out of myself. I remove that assumption. It was great. I have, I think it's Persuasion on my to read pile, so like, I don't want to dip into it too soon because I don't want to like experience them all and then have nothing. But like I'm looking forward to that when that happens as well. Then we've got Strange Magic by Sid Moore, which is my Halloweeny read. It's not Halloween yet when I'm recording this, but I wanted to like get in ahead. Rosie Strange inherits the Essex Witch Museum from her grandfather. Her grandfather and her father were quite estranged, so she's a bit surprised by this. She goes to check it out, and essentially her and like the curator called Sam get embroiled in this mystery, this spooky mystery involving this boy who appears to be possessed by the ghost of the son of Ursula Cadence, who was a witch who was murdered in the 1600s. And essentially, like, it's really important they find Ursula Cadence's bones, and they set off on this mystery, and it's just them, like, doing this whole thing. I will say, I think I thought this was going to be, this wasn't as spooky as I expected, insofar as, like, supernatural things are definitely afoot, yes. Good point is lots of history in this. If you're not very familiar with, like, British witchcraft history, this will give you everything, like, you need to know to enjoy this story. Like, it gives you a lot of info, which is really great. I really enjoyed that side of it. Just a lot of this is spent sleuthing out these bones, so it's less of, like, a spooky book. I wasn't, like, scared at any point, but it's more of, like, a mystery detective-y, given that neither of them are detectives. You know, they're trying to solve this mystery type thing. I think the one thing that annoyed me at times was that I'm like fully signed up for spooky supernatural stuff, and because my main character is like a skeptic, we got very far into the book. Even when supernatural things are happening, she's still searching for the explanation of what could explain them that's not supernatural. And I, at times, was just like, just embrace it, Rosie. I'm signed up, and I need you to be signed up because I need my spookiness. That was like my only critique. I enjoyed this. This is the first part of a series. I'm not sure if I'll be continuing it. I think if I saw them in my library, I'd take them out and read them, but I don't know if I would buy them to read. That's something I'm just going to have to give time and see if I get the urge for or not. Okay, finally, this is the book which I am currently reading, which I haven't finished yet, but I have nearly finished. The Gastronomical Me by MFK Fisher. I've been reading this in bits and pieces for like a few weeks now, because it's really nice to dip in and out of. I entirely understand why MFK Fisher is such a big name in the food writing, because this is just lovely. She does that thing which I like, where it's like it's talking about food, but it's also talking about people, so it's all grounded in experiences and little snapshots of her life, because it's a book of essays, different essays on food, and sort of like just like it's sort of taking us through her life and her relationships in her life and stuff like this, and like really important moments, but just like as seen and experienced where food also played a big role. So yeah, it's interesting. I am still enjoying this like food writing exploration thing that's going on, and this I would say is like masterfully done, so I'm really enjoying that. And also the book I haven't got around to reading is Gastronomical Me by Jane Harris, and I'm about to take part of Non-Fiction November, so this is just going to like go back on the to-read pile, and I'll get to it at some point because I've got some non-fiction goals to do instead, which I've either posted or am going to post next week. I don't know what order these are going up in. That's it, a little reading wrap-up. As per usual, would love to hear your thoughts on any of these. Have I tempted you into reading any of them? I don't know. Have I? What did you read this autumn? What does autumn make you want to read? That sort of thing. Other than that, I hope you have a super lovely day, and I will see you next week for something different.